Hi, this is a PowerPoint video about U.S. military spending. And the key questions here are what changes in military spending, if any, do you suggest, and why those changes? Of course, we want to base our opinions and recommendations on facts, and you cannot judge a fact or a statistic in isolation, in a vacuum, on its own. You need context, you need a frame of reference. So, we're going to look at both dollars spent and spending as a percent of income. We're going to look at changes over time, and we're going to look at where and how the money is spent, and we'll look at other countries. That way, you can make a fully informed opinion. So, how much does the federal government spend on the military? Well, here you can see it went up with the Korean War, it went up during the Vietnam War, there was a Reagan buildup in the 1980s, and here we had 9/11 terrorist attacks, and then we spent more because of the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. Uh, Now we spend in 2020 about $700 billion a year. That's the green. We're right about here now, 700 billion. Or as a percent of our GDP, that is our gross domestic product, that is our national income, it's 3%. All right. So that's the y axis on the left, shows you spend about 3% of the nation's money on defense. Do you think that's okay? Is this too much or too little? 3% to keep us safe? That sounds pretty good. $700 billion a year over here on the right in the y axis? That sounds like a lot of money. So I want you to think, do you think we spend too much or too little on the military? I like this slide because we go back even farther in time. We go back to 1800, basically the start of this country when Thomas Jefferson was president. And here we're looking at military spending as a percent of GDP. In other words, as a percent of our national income. All right. So you should see here three spikes. And what caused those spikes? 1860s, 19 teens, 1940s. What caused those spikes? And compared to 1800, military spending now is higher or lower than it was in 1800. In other words, even as the country has gotten richer over the centuries, are we spending more or less on the military? Now, here we are in 2019. This is the federal government budget. Roughly what percent of the federal government budget is spent on the military? Here you see this is mostly Medicare and Medicaid. That's healthcare. It's about 24, 25%. It's about a quarter. Here's Social Security. Again, it's about a quarter. Roughly what percent do we spend on defense? This other category is welfare. This is interest on the debt we have to pay back. Okay, roughly what percent do we spend on defense? Let's break down defense spending into categories. Where does the money actually go? Well, if you look at the red, you can see it goes to personnel, that is, to the soldiers, to their pay and to their housing. That pay is going up. White is the weapons category, procurement, that's buying guns and tanks and weapons for the soldiers. Blue is operations, that's fighting wars. It's also practice. The military practices every day, and it costs a lot of money to fly a jet. The jet fuel is very expensive, and to power a ship and to practice dropping bombs, it's all very expensive. Green is research and development to develop new weapons and the nuclear program and constructing, building bases. That's where the money goes. And you can see again, it's gone up, especially after 9/11, 2001. So, what, if anything, would you cut? Would you pay soldiers less? Would you spend less on weapons, or do you want to have the best weapons? Would you cut back on practice, or do you want our men and women soldiers to practice? Would you cut back in research, or do you want to keep our edge as the best military in the world? These are some tough decisions. Again, where does U.S. defense spending go? If you look here again, this is personnel, this is pay, operations and maintenance, that's practice, that's fighting wars, that's maintaining the trucks and the vehicles and the ships and the tanks. Here's weapons procurement and research and development to make sure we maintain our lead as the best military in the world. Here's a breakdown by Army service, that is the branch. So you see the Army gets about a quarter, the Navy gets about a quarter, the Air Force gets about a quarter, okay? Pretty evenly divided. Now, let's look at pay more closely. We have active duty military, those are the soldiers now on duty. Civilians, the military also pays civilians, maybe as a cook or a driver. And we also have reserves, National Guard, and retired soldiers also get a pension. Okay, so would you cut spending on any of these groups? Or do you say, no, these people did their duty, it's dangerous work, we should pay them well? Here you see what's happened to the number of personnel in our military. What's happened to the number of people in our military? Over the years, over the last 50, 60, 70 years, has the number of the people in the military overall gone up or gone down? Why is the number of personnel falling? Partly because the Cold War is over. We're no longer fighting Russia and the Soviet Union and worried about terrorism. And partly it's because the nature of warfare is changing. We now have fewer ground troops, fewer infantry fighting in close combat on the ground. That's not how wars happen anymore. There's more fighting done from afar, from long distance. For example, we use planes now more, and we have fewer planes that are manned with pilots. We have more UAVs, more unmanned aerial vehicles, also known as drones. We're also doing a lot more fighting through missiles, Tomahawks, cruise missiles, anti-aircraft missiles. So we don't need quite as many soldiers in the military. Now, where does the spending go? Part two. It goes to these defense contractors, Lockheed Martin, Boeing, Raytheon, Northrop, General Dynamics, United Technologies. These are huge companies. All right, you can see here the size of the contracts they got from the military, $35 billion in 2013 alone. Boeing got $20 million, okay? And these are the products that they make. Again, we're doing more and more with missiles and satellites and planes. If you look at the workers, you can see these companies employ thousands and thousands of workers, all right? And their headquarters are around the country. Here you see Lockheed Martin just outside Washington, D.C., so that they can be close to the government. Here's Raytheon in Lexington and Waltham, right up Route 2, so they can get the good, smart graduates coming out of Harvard and MIT and Northeastern. If you cut defense spending, what happens to the number of jobs at these companies? What's going to happen to the US economy? And if you do that to those jobs, what do you think is going to happen to votes? You think people are going to vote for you if you vote to cut government's military spending? Now, where does the money go? Part three. Let's look at geography. And you can see here the black and the red dots are where we have bases. There are roughly 5,000 bases in the United States, another 800 overseas. That's roughly 5,500 bases total. And you see the bases are in almost every state, because when you have a base in your state, that means federal money is going to go to your state. If you cut spending, what's going to happen to those bases? If you close those bases, what then is going to happen to the towns? What's going to happen to the stores and businesses in towns if you cut the base? What's going to happen to the houses in town and the real estate market? What's going to happen to the restaurants and the bars and the barber shops? So do you think that the politicians from those areas fight to keep their bases open? Yes or no? Why or why not? What happens when you close a base? What happens to the town? So here's an example of a base that got closed, and now you see there are just weeds growing, and the buildings are abandoned, and the soldiers move away or the soldiers retire, what do you think happens to the real estate market? And again, what happens to the businesses in town? Do they suffer or do they prosper? Here's a look at our U.S. military presence overseas. You can see the red dots. Those are the countries with military bases. Okay? And you see where they are around the world. If you cut back on spending by closing bases overseas, what would happen? Could we refuel our planes and our ships as easily and quickly? Could we respond to problems as fast if we close down bases? And would those host countries, would those allies be happy with us if we close down bases? So again, what would you cut? If you think the military spends too much, what and where would you cut? Again, the United States is not the only country in the world, so let's compare it to other countries and see what do they spend. All right, how does US military spending compare to other countries? Do they spend more on their militaries or less? Here are the top 20 defense budgets as of 2013. Where does the United States rank? Are we the biggest spender, middle of the pack? Are we one of the smallest spenders? This is a little bit more recent. I think this is 2018, 2019. How does the US defense spending compare to other countries? Here's the United States. Again, we spend about $700 billion a year. How does that compare to other countries? The United States, just one country, now accounts for roughly what fraction of world military spending? So here we are, 2013, roughly today, and if you take that across, you can see that's roughly what percent, roughly what fraction of the world's military spending is done by just one country. I think this is a good slide. Here's the US in black. The US has just 4% of the world's population, but we have about 25%, about a quarter of the world's economy. We're a big, rich country. And look at military spending. Again, we spend about 33%, about a third of the world's military spending. So do you think this is way too much? Do you think it's okay? And why? Now, military power depends on economic power. You should remember from U.S. history class that the North won the Civil War because it had more factories, it could make more guns and bullets and supplies. You should remember that the U.S. won the Spanish-American War because we had steel ships and more supplies than Spain did, and we were able to win in Cuba and Puerto Rico and that kind of thing. World War II is another example. How and why did the Allies win in World War II? Well, let's look simply at the number of warplanes in World War II. The United States made 300,000 warplanes. If you can combine that with our allies in Britain, and the Soviet Union back then was our ally, you see that the Allies had about 600,000 warplanes, and Germany and Japan, our enemy, had about 200,000, 600,000 to 200,000. We had 3 times as many warplanes. Let's look at tanks in World War II. 80,000 by the US, 20,000 by Great Britain, 100,000 the Allies here. We had about 200,000 tanks. Germany and Japan together only had about 50,000 tanks. We had 4 times as many tanks. That's how we were able to win World War II, or it was one reason. What about ships? This is the tonnage or weight of the ships. And if you add up the United States and Great Britain, we had about 10 million tons worth of warships. Germany and Japan only had 2 million, so we had 5 times as many ships or in terms of tonnage. You should remember our factories were able to crank it out. Here are the tanks. Here's some bombers. Please remember Rosie the Riveter here, and we were able to crank it out. Our factories, our economy was huge. Let's bring it up to today. What's the point of these graphics? Military spending requires a big, rich economy or a small, poor one? Well, let's look at this. The cost of one F-16 fighter jet, $40 million. Our latest jet is the F-35. F stands for fighter. It's basically $100 million for one jet. Let's look at some of these planes here. And this is just to operate it for 1 hour of flight. Okay. So that, again, jet fuel is really expensive. So this E4 Night Watch, it's basically $150,000 just for 1 hour of flight. B-2 stealth bomber, about $130,000 for 1 hour of flight. So when you practice every day, it's expensive, and certainly wars are expensive. So military spending requires what kind of an economy? Now, aircraft carriers are really important. They basically are portable bases that can sail around the world, and we can land planes on them. Okay, and you see here the latest aircraft carriers, the USS Gerald Ford. The cost of a Gerald Ford and two other aircraft carriers, $43 billion. So if three aircraft carriers cost about $42 billion, roughly how much does one aircraft carrier cost? So our military is expensive, and you got to have a big, rich economy to pay for it. All right, so who are the top economic powers who might be able to turn their factories into making militaries? The United States has the biggest, richest, best economy in the world. China's second. Japan is third, but Japan is our ally. Germany's fourth, but Germany is our ally. 5 and 6 are England and France. They're also our allies. So, really, the only threat, the number one threat to the United States today is whom? All right. How does the U.S. how does the U.S. compare to China? We have 300 million people. China has 3 times that, almost 4 times that. So, who has the advantage there? We have 1.5 million soldiers. China's 2.2. But again, the actual number of soldiers doesn't matter quite as much these days. It's your military technology and weapons that matter more. We have 13,000 warplanes. China has 3,000. So who is the advantage there? We have 8,000 tanks. China's 9,000. We have about 475 ships. China's 520, but our ships are much better. We have 11 aircraft carriers. China has 2. We have 72 submarines. China's 69. Ours are more advanced. The U.S. economy is about $23 trillion, and China's about 17. So who has the advantage here? Could the U.S. and China have a war? Consider these flashpoints, these tension points. All right, China doesn't get along well with Tibet in the West. China also has some border fights with India. The big tension point, the big flashpoint is this South China Sea in between China and Vietnam and the Philippines and Taiwan. And China claims a lot of it, and these other countries don't want China to claim a lot of it. So the South China Sea is a tense flashpoint. What about nuclear weapons? The U.S. has got roughly 5,000. These countries, Britain, France, and Israel, are our friends. Russia's an enemy. North Korea is very undependable. China's got about 250. Why have so many nuclear weapons? Well, it's partly to spread them out. Why? Why do you not want to have your nuclear weapons all in one place? Think about what would happen if the enemy would attack. And we want to have a lot of nuclear weapons so that if the U.S. were attacked first, the U.S. would have enough nuclear weapons left over to do what? And so we have some of our nuclear missiles underground in these silos. We have some of them in the air in the old-fashioned bombers and the stealth bombers. And we have some of them underwater in nuclear submarines. It's called the nuclear triad. You want to have your nukes in 3 different places. So what changes in military spending, if any, do you suggest? Do you want less or more military spending? What changes would you make and why those changes? I hope this was clear. If you have any questions, please let me know. Thank you.